Okay, so we are exploring this title idea, the Ramseys and the mystery of the marks that changed everything. And this topic, as we've been digging into this whole thing and trying to piece together what those puzzling abrasions really mean, weighing stun gun theories against train track possibilities, and even more unconventional explanations. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. When we step back and look at this case, the names that inevitably come forward are Lou Smith, John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, Burke Ramsey, James Kolar, and even the team of so-called experts from the case of JonBenet Ramsey. Each of them added a layer of interpretation that shaped how people think about what happened. Lou Smith leaned heavily toward the stun gun explanation, while Kolar and CBS tried to frame the train tracks as the cause of those puzzling marks. Burke himself, in his interviews, dismissed the idea entirely, and John and Patsy gave their own versions of earlier incidents that raised questions about accidents versus intent. What makes all of this worth unpacking is that these marks on JonBenet's body, small as they were, became the flashpoint where science, psychology, and narrative collided. The most critical thread running through this debate is not simply whether the marks came from a stun gun, a train track, or even an ornament. The deeper question is about purpose, what those marks meant in the context of that night. Were they an act of testing, a desperate attempt to wake someone, or something else altogether? The conversation has always swung between competing possibilities, and yet what lingers is the sense that the abrasions carry meaning far beyond their physical appearance. They serve almost like a signature detail that refuses to fit neatly into one theory. What's interesting is how the conversation shifts depending on who is speaking. Lou Smith, with his background in homicide investigation, saw a calculated intruder and attached the stun gun to that narrative. Kolar, by contrast, emphasized improvisation within the home, pointing to the train set as a more plausible explanation. CBS leaned into his version because it gave them a simple, dramatic story to tell. Meanwhile, Burke's denial added a human element. Was this quick response a sign of honesty or of defensiveness? And woven through it all are John and Patsy, shaping public perception with their recollections and insistence on innocence. Another key aspect is how forensic science collides with criminological reasoning. Science can tell us about abrasions, burns, timing of blood circulation, and whether a mark was made before or after responsiveness, but it cannot tell us motive. That's where criminology, psychology, and philosophy step in, trying to explain intent, mindset, and purpose. This duality, hard evidence versus interpretive meaning, is at the heart of why these debates never reach closure. Every conclusion ends up being weighed against not just the mark itself, but against what that mark supposedly represents. So, in setting the stage, we are really looking at more than just a technical puzzle. We're stepping into a battlefield of interpretations where forensic measurements clash with psychological speculation and where each character brings their own lens to the same piece of evidence. That's what makes this worth digging into. The realization that the abrasions aren't just evidence, they're a mirror reflecting all the uncertainty, contradiction, and complexity of this case. With that frame in mind, we can turn to the deeper analysis of what these marks might mean and why they continue to dominate the discussion. Let's delve into the fascinating and often conflicting interpretations surrounding the injuries JonBenet Ramsey sustained, particularly focusing on the stun gun versus train tracks theories that emerged during the investigation. The stun gun versus train tracks theories. In The Death of Innocence, Lou Smith, a highly respected Colorado homicide detective who joined the Boulder DA's office to review the case, concluded that JonBenet was taken by an intruder who subdued her with a stun gun, then subjected her to inappropriate contact, and her passing occurred in the basement. The autopsy report from OCR_Ramsey, JonBenet_autopsy report, details two dried, rust-colored to slightly purple abrasions on the left lateral aspect of her lower back, approximately 16.25 and 17.5 inches below the top of her head, measuring 0.125 by 0.0625 inches and 0.1875 by 0.125 inches, respectively. In The Death of Innocence, John Ramsey recounts that Lou Smith, along with other investigators, explored whether these marks could have come from a stun gun, specifically narrowing it down to an air taser. Patsy Ramsey, in her August 2000 interview, also indicated that Lou Smith was a source of information regarding the potential use of a stun gun. However, the television series The Case of JonBenet Ramsey, as detailed in the Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit, posited an alternative theory that Burke Ramsey inflicted these stun gun injuries with his toy train track. According to the lawsuit, this theory, along with the idea that the marks in the upper head area were caused by a flashlight, was largely lifted from James Kollar's book, Foreign Faction. The Burke Dr. Phil transcript, 1NR_JonBenet Ramsey wiki_Burke Ramsey interview sources show that Burke Ramsey did have a train set at home. In the television series The Case of JonBenet Ramsey, Kollar described finding O-gauge track pieces in the train room and Burke's bedroom and claimed that scaled pictures showed the pins connecting the tracks matched exactly to JonBenet's injuries. If we start by looking at the competing object theories, we can see that the difficulty lies not in identifying one plausible source, but in the overwhelming variety of possible explanations. Some say stun gun, others say train tracks, still others suggest ordinary household items like ornaments. That wide range in itself shows how difficult it is to pin down certainty when a mark could be shaped by any number of common objects. When we consider the abrasions from a physiological angle, we realize the skin reacts differently depending on the force and texture of contact. A narrow, hard edge leaves a defined outline, while a rounded surface creates more diffuse bruising. The very precision of the marks in this case raises the question of whether the object had corners or pins rather than smooth curves. In regards to the depth of the discoloration, it's worth noting that color changes in skin after an impact result from blood seeping into tissue. A reddish or purplish hue indicates a pooling of blood beneath the surface, which suggests not just a light touch, but a degree of force. This makes the question less about what the object was and more about why such pressure was applied in the first place. If we pause and think about the sequence of events, it could be that the mark was not random but came at a critical moment. Maybe it was a reaction to panic, a reflexive attempt to stir movement, or even an impulsive test of responsiveness. The timing matters because the presence of such marks might connect to the broader timeline of that night. When we consider the behavioral frame of reference, one has to ask what sort of state of mind a person is in when they resort to pushing an object into someone's skin. Is it anger? Is it panic? Is it testing? Behavioral criminology often looks at whether action suggests control, chaos, or calculation. Here, the pressing of an object suggests a moment of uncertainty rather than confidence. If we think about the forensic framing of objects, the challenge is that different tools can leave nearly identical impressions. For example, forensic pathologists often compare pattern injuries to shoes, tools, or even household items. But without the actual object in hand, it is guesswork. That's why some experts lean toward train tracks, others to stun guns, and some even to household ornaments. In considering the purpose behind the mark, the real question becomes less about the object and more about intent. Was it to cause pain, to test responsiveness, to leave a signal, or to express frustration? Each possibility shifts the narrative of what happened that night and what the perpetrator's psychological state might have been. If we explore the idea of a possible scream connection, we can see how this mark might tie to witness accounts of hearing noises. A sharp prod could have triggered a reflexive cry. And if that cry was indeed heard by neighbors, then the timing of the mark becomes a crucial puzzle piece in understanding the sequence. When we think about the lack of clarity around the cause of death. This mark could represent a link between earlier and later actions. There were multiple contributing factors, and the order of those factors remains debated. If this prod happened earlier, it may have set off a chain of events. If it happened later, it might signal desperation after something had already gone terribly wrong. If we reflect on the narrative built by the ransom letter, it frames the situation as an attack on John Ramsey tied to his wealth and position, but the placement of these marks tells a different story. They are personal, focused on JonBenet herself, not on John. That dissonance between the letter's words and the physical evidence hints at misdirection. When we look at the philosophical side of criminology, we see that marks like these can represent symbolic actions. A push or prod may not only be physical, but can serve as a way for the perpetrator to assert dominance or test boundaries. It's a small act, but in forensic psychology, small acts can speak volumes about control dynamics. In considering alternative objects like ornaments, what is interesting is how ordinary household items become possible instruments of explanation. It doesn't necessarily mean the theory is correct, but it reflects how even everyday objects can become significant under extraordinary circumstances. If we keep in mind the technical aspects of skin response, an abrasion like this occurs when the top layer of skin is scraped or pressed by a firm edge. Unlike burns or cuts, abrasions don't penetrate deep but still create a noticeable mark, explaining that in layman's terms, it's more like the scrape you'd get if you rubbed your skin hard against a textured surface. When we think about the forensic sequencing, one question is whether the mark was made while blood was still circulating. If circulation had already slowed or stopped, the mark may appear darker and without swelling. This helps pathologists determine whether the prod occurred before or after life processes ceased. In terms of behavioral deduction, we might ask, what does it mean to poke someone with an object in a moment of crisis? It could mean impatience, a lack of empathy, or a desperate attempt to verify awareness. Each explanation points to a different type of perpetrator psychology. If we move toward the idea of panic versus control, we find a contradiction. Panic suggests someone acting without foresight, lashing out, or testing wildly. Control suggests someone measured, checking responses to calculate the next step. The prod could fit either, which is why this mark remains ambiguous. When we factor in the philosophical framing of purpose, it challenges us to ask, what purpose does pressing an object into someone serve? If it was simply to hurt, the act seems petty compared to the larger sequence. If it was to test, then the prod may represent hesitation or doubt, which tells us more about the perpetrator's indecision. If we weigh the testimony of experts against each other, we realize they often argue less about the physical mark itself and more about what the mark represents. One calls it electrical, another mechanical, another ornamental. What's really being debated is not shape but meaning. When we reflect on the forensic principle of parsimony, the simplest explanation is often best. A household item like a train track or ornament is simpler than assuming a specialized weapon like a stun gun was brought in. But simplicity must be balanced with consistency in the broader narrative. In terms of the criminological philosophy of misdirection, it's worth considering whether the mark was ever meant to confuse investigators. If a perpetrator left a mark knowing it could resemble multiple objects, it would complicate the investigation and shift focus away from their true method. If we try to place ourselves in the mindset of the perpetrator, we might imagine someone facing an unresponsive body and trying to prompt a reaction. The prod then becomes less about harm and more about verification. In that sense, the mark becomes a trace of indecision rather than aggression. When we examine the connection between physiology and psychology, the prod links the two. The body reacts in discoloration, while the mind behind it is revealed in motive. What looks like a simple mark may actually expose the thought process of hesitation, testing, or impatience. If we circle back to the question of why this mark matters, it's because it anchors so many of the debates. Without the mark, the discussion of stun gun versus train tracks versus ornaments wouldn't exist. the mark itself becomes a focal point where science, psychology, and philosophy converge. In conclusion, for this first point, when we think about the multiplicity of possible objects, we see that the prod is not just about physical evidence, but about the story it tells. It reflects uncertainty, it reflects possible panic, and it reflects an act that forces us to ask not just what object was used, but why it was used at all. Why investigators believed JonBenet's wounds could have come from Burke's train tracks instead of a stun gun. In the television series, The Case of JonBenet Ramsey, the pseudo-experts on the show sought to debunk the stun gun theory. As shown in Burke Ramsey versus CBS and The Case of JonBenet Ramsey, they conducted a demonstration where a 215-pound man was tased with a stun gun. Pseudo-expert Laura Richards, as noted in Burke Ramsey versus CBS and The Case of JonBenet Ramsey, concluded from this demonstration that the stun gun does the actual opposite from subduing someone, as the subject reacted verbally and was not rendered unconscious. Dr. Werner Spitz, also a pseudo-expert in the series, claimed that if a stun gun were used on a child, they would have a scream from this kid that would have gone through the entire building, implying that the Ramseys would have heard it if a stun gun was used to subdue JonBenet. The lawsuit instead, Kolar, in the case of JonBenet Ramsey, asserted that the marks on JonBenet's back were abrasions, not burn marks, and that a taser company itself had said they were not the type of marks left by their stun guns. He presented his colleague Sergeant Harry Stevens, who found a piece of O-gauge train track that, when scaled, matched exactly to the injuries on JonBenet, as described in Burke Ramsey versus CBS. Spitz supported this, stating that the marks had a central defect from something penetrating the skin, and that JonBenet was obviously without a blood circulation at the time due to the absence of red body fluid. And of course, you know what I mean when I say red body fluid, in the pictures of the marks. This suggested that the marks appeared after JonBenet was already unresponsive, which meant that a stun device would not have been needed to subdue her. Richards and Kolar further speculated that Burke might have used the train track in an attempt to wake JonBenet, reasoning that an adult in such a situation would more likely have called 911 for medical assistance. And we can continue to think about why the train track theory gained traction by noticing how quickly the CBS experts dismissed the stun gun idea. Their point was simple: a stun gun creates an involuntary outburst, not quiet compliance. If you're trying to remain unnoticed, a sudden cry or spasm ruins the plan, which is why they lean toward an alternative explanation. In considering the logic of stealth versus noise, the contrast is striking. The supposed intruder was described as calculated, slipping in and out without leaving much behind. Yet if that same intruder brought in a device that causes shouting or thrashing, the entire image collapses. Stealth and noise simply don't match. And along the same lines, we might consider the importance of mark consistency, because tasers usually leave evenly spaced electrical dots where the prongs hit. If those marks are irregular, off-centered, or have texture to them, they better match something mechanical like the pins of a train track than a clean electrical contact. And if we think about the philosophy of criminology in terms of offender decision-making, we find that those who plan carefully rarely choose unpredictable tools. Bringing in an electrical device into a situation where silence is needed contradicts that kind of planning. Choosing an everyday object in the room, however, aligns better with adaptability. In addition to that, we can consider the idea of situational improvisation, where an offender uses what's at hand rather than carrying specialized equipment. If someone inside the house reached for nearby objects, a toy train track fits that reasoning much better than sneaking in with a stun gun. When we reflect on the psychological profile of an intruder versus a household actor, the divergence grows even sharper. An outsider might rely on pre-planned tools. An insider, in contrast, acts impulsively and grabs what's close. The presence of the train track in Burke's room makes the insider explanation at least somewhat plausible under this framework. On the same topic, it's worth asking about forensic parsimony, the idea that the simplest explanation often has the most weight, which is simpler, that a stranger brought in an obscure electronic device, or that a household item made the marks. The principle of parsimony would favor the latter. If we add the question of symbolic behavior, we can also look at whether the use of a toy as an object has deeper meaning. Some criminological theories suggest that when familiar objects are used, it reflects an emotional tie, not just convenience. That complicates the narrative because it connects object choice with relationship dynamics. And when we explore the counter-argument about electrical incapacity, one expert suggested a child would cry out so loudly from an electric prod that the entire house would react. That challenges the logic of silence maintained throughout the night. This reasoning, while speculative, adds weight to the rejection of the stun gun theory. Considering the limitations of television reconstructions, the staged nature of these tests often sacrifices scientific rigor for drama. That means viewers are left with a convincing image rather than reliable data. So, while the demonstration swayed audiences, it doesn't necessarily hold forensic strength. In addition to this, we might think about the forensic concept of abrasion versus burn, which is central here. An abrasion is a superficial scraping caused by friction or blunt pressure. A burn, especially electrical chars or blisters tissue. These technical differences, when explained simply, make it easier to see why abrasions align with train tracks rather than electricity. And if we turn to the criminological principle of rational choice, it suggests offenders weigh risks and rewards before acting. A stun gun carries the risk of being heard, while pressing a toy train track leaves minimal disruption. Deductively, one is less risky than the other. Along the same lines, the presence of train track pieces in Burke's room gave investigators a physical comparison. Scaled images reportedly matched the spacing of the marks exactly. While not conclusive, this visual reinforcement strengthened belief in the train track theory, at least for those already skeptical of the stun gun claim. When we continue thinking about situational behavior under stress, we recognize that stressed individuals often reach for the nearest item. This might explain why an everyday toy could be involved. It's not elaborate planning. It's immediate and unthinking, which fits a different psychological frame. On the forensic side, we might look at the concept of central defect, which Dr. Spitz mentioned. A central defect means the mark has a tiny puncture-like center, as if something pressed inward rather than burned across. This detail fits pins or prongs more than it fits electrical current. If we reflect further on the silence of the night, it becomes notable that no one in the house reported hearing anything that resembled an electrical shock reaction. If such a sound had occurred, neighbors or parents would likely have heard. That silence reinforces the argument against the stun gun. And another related idea is the problem of missing evidence, because if a stun gun was actually used, investigators should have looked for electrical residue or conductive transfer on clothing. The absence of such findings weakens the case for the device being involved. When we look inside the mind of the perpetrator, we might imagine someone who wanted to avoid drawing attention. If the person was already nervous about being discovered, they would avoid any tool that could make unpredictable noise. This is why the theory of a household item being used resonates with logical deduction. If we probe the philosophy of forensic framing, the television special may have leaned toward the train track explanation, not just for evidence, but for narrative simplicity. It's easier to explain to an audience that a toy caused the marks than to dive into electrical pathology. That narrative convenience may have colored the theory's presentation. And considering criminological uncertainty, we see that multiple interpretations are still possible, but the dismissal of the stun gun idea often rests more on deductive reasoning than hard evidence. Silence, consistency of marks, and psychological plausibility all weigh against it, even if no definitive proof supports the train track theory either. If we think one step deeper into the philosophy of means and opportunity, the distinction becomes sharper. An outsider with specialized tools implies planning far beyond what was evidenced. An insider explanation leans on opportunity and immediacy, which feels more consistent with the situation. And in conclusion, for this second point, when we think through stealth, physiology, and logic, the train track explanation gains traction not because it's proven, but because it avoids contradictions that the stun gun theory introduces. It represents the path of least resistance in both criminological reasoning and forensic interpretation. Burke's quick dismissal and conflicting interpretations in his Dr. Phil. Transcript 1 interview, when asked if he ever made contact with JonBenet using the train tracks or poked her with them, Burke Ramsey quickly replied, "No, not the moment you said that. I was like, how would I even do that? Like, I never did anything like that." The Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit characterizes this quick dismissal by Burke as a natural reaction, noting that the experts on the show used unscientific analysis to suggest otherwise, implying deception. The lawsuit argues that the entire theory presented by the television series was a fraudulent charade aimed at falsely accusing Burke, using manipulated information and staged demonstrations, and that his innocence is definitively established by the overwhelming evidence. Conflicting interpretations of injury patterns significantly complicate forensic certainty in this case. In John Ramsey 1998 interview, Lou Smith suggested that a stun gun was involved, a view he believed strongly. In her April 1997 interview, Patsy Ramsey mentioned Burke making contact with JonBenet in the face with a golf club once, which left a black eye and a teensy little scar, but she stated it was just kind of a skin abrasion and a pure accident. Burke Ramsey, in his Dr. Phil Transcript 1 interview, also acknowledged accidentally clipping JonBenet with a golf club on his backswing, but denied intentionally making contact with her. In John Ramsey June 1998 interview, he also recalled the golf club incident as a pure accident. However, Judith Phillips, interviewed in the television series, stated that Burke had a bad temper and hit JonBenet with a golf club in the face, implying intent. This statement was strategically spliced in by the series to convey that Burke could have killed JonBenet in a fit of anger, directly contradicting Burke and John's accounts of an accident. Furthermore, in the August 2000 interview, John Ramsey explained that experts he consulted believed that certain marks in the upper head area appeared after JonBenet had already passed or was very close to passing. In her own August 2000 interview, Patsy Ramsey echoed this, noting that her forensic experts concluded her daughter's passing was linked to circumstances in the region between the chin and chest, and that the marks near the head area came afterward, pointing to the very minimal presence of red body fluid. And of course, you know what I mean when I use that phrasing. This differs from the position of Spitz and Clemente in the case of JonBenet Ramsey, who argued that the marks near the head area were the main cause of her passing, and that what followed in the neck region was an attempt to stage the scene. The Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit highlighted this as a central contradiction, pointing out that the television series appeared to manufacture a storyline where the parents created the cord device after Burke's initial involvement, even though other evidence suggested JonBenet still showed signs of awareness during the events around the neck region. This fundamental disagreement over the sequence and cause of the changes observed, together with the competing theories about the origin of specific surface marks, whether from a stun device or from something resembling train tracks, underscores the profound difficulty in reaching forensic certainty. These unresolved questions continue to fuel differing interpretations and theories about who was ultimately responsible for JonBenet Ramsey's death. And in regards to the term accidental, the discussion becomes very nuanced. Accidental can mean something entirely unplanned, but it can also mean unintended, even if the action was deliberate. For example, swinging a golf club is deliberate, but accidentally clipping someone nearby is unintended. This gray area makes the concept slippery. When we think about the role of intent, it's worth noting that intent in criminology isn't just about whether someone meant to cause harm, but whether they understood the consequences of their actions. Children, for instance, may act with intent to do something but lack full grasp of what it means. That distinction becomes important in framing how events are interpreted. And if we focus on the forensic side of accidental versus deliberate, marks themselves cannot tell us about intent. They show what physically happened, but not why it happened. Interpreting intent comes from behavior, patterns, and context, not just from the wound itself. This is where the debate often shifts away from science and into speculation. In addition to that, the contradictions across interviews add another layer. John and Patsy consistently described prior incidents, like the golf club swing, as accidents, but others, like Judith Phillips, interpreted the same events as deliberate. This shows how witness perception of intent can differ drastically depending on their relationship to the people involved. When we consider the legal framing of accident, it becomes even more layered. In law, an accident can reduce culpability, but repeated accidents might be read as a pattern. That's why jurors and investigators look closely at whether something fits the description of a one-off mishap or points to a repeated behavioral issue. And if we keep in mind the criminological principle of narrative construction, Burke's denial becomes part of a larger story. Some frame him as unfairly targeted by media narratives, while others frame him as a possible actor in events. His words are not evaluated in isolation, but against the larger picture being painted. When we think about body language and tone in denials, criminologists often note that truthfulness isn't always about words, but delivery. A quick no may be natural, but people often expect hesitation when recalling details. That expectation gap is what can make natural speech patterns appear suspicious. Along the same lines, we might think about how memory works under pressure, because memory recall is rarely perfect. Quick denials can come not only from certainty, but from a lack of memory altogether. If someone doesn't recall ever doing a thing, they'll reject it outright without entertaining the possibility. And if we extend this into the philosophy of culpability, we find ourselves questioning what it means to be responsible. If someone acts without understanding consequences, are they guilty in the same way as someone who acts knowingly? Philosophers of law and criminology debate this constantly, and the Ramsey case offers a real-world context for that discussion. When we continue to think about accident as a category, we should note that it carries emotional weight. People are more willing to accept an accident when it involves strangers, but less so when it involves family. That emotional framing shapes how audiences interpret Burke's words. On the same topic, the ambiguity of language makes a huge difference. Saying, "I didn't do that," is different from saying, "I don't remember doing that." One is absolute, the other allows for possibility. Burke's firm denial left no room for possibility, which is why it drew attention. And if we consider the forensic framing of sequence of events, the question becomes, were the marks on JonBenet's body before or after certain key events? This sequencing matters because if they happened later, then the need for intent to subdue disappears, which changes the entire logic of the case. In addition to this, the criminological idea of overkill versus restraint might be considered. If someone goes beyond what is necessary, it suggests emotion or panic. If someone leaves only minimal marks, it suggests restraint or uncertainty. The marks being so limited could point toward hesitation rather than aggression. When we explore the mental state of the actor involved, it is plausible that they acted in a haze of confusion, not fully understanding the situation. That possibility frames accident less as innocence and more as ignorance of consequences. It becomes less about denial and more about perspective. And if we place ourselves inside the mindset of the perpetrator, we might see someone torn between denial of responsibility and an inability to process what happened. In this way, a quick dismissal could reflect a psychological need to reject guilt outright, even in the face of questions. On the same lines, the sociological perspective reminds us that society often demands clean labels, guilty or innocent, accident or intentional. But real life is messy, and Burke's denial sits in that messy middle where quick answers are distrusted because they don't satisfy the need for complexity. When we bring in the concept of forensic framing, again, the CBS special capitalized on that complexity. By framing Burke's denial as suspicious, they could push their narrative forward. But that framing might not reflect forensic reality. It might simply be a media tool. And another related idea is the concept of defensive posture in criminology. People under suspicion often deny forcefully, not just to avoid blame, but to protect their identity. Saying, "I never did that," is not just about the event. It's about rejecting the label of someone capable of doing it. In terms of deductive reasoning about consistency, one would ask whether Burke's denials match his statements elsewhere. If he consistently denies in similar fashion across interviews, that consistency could be a point in his favor. If the tone shifts, that inconsistency could raise questions. And if we examine the philosophy of truth and perception, we realize that truth is not just about facts, but how facts are received. A statement that is true may still be doubted if it doesn't match expectations. Burke's quick denial, therefore, may be truthful yet disbelieved, because it doesn't align with what people expect to hear. When we close out this third point, by reflecting on the broader contradictions, we see how accident, intent, and denial all blur together. The term accident can mean many things, and denial can signal either honesty or defensiveness. It leaves us with a situation where forensic science can tell us what happened physically, but not why, and it's the why that remains contested. Okay, let's discuss a few things a little further that we've talked about thus far, and maybe take them into deeper territory. One of the most striking issues is how many different objects could theoretically match the abrasions. You've got stun gun theories, train track theories, even ornament theories. The real puzzle here isn't just the object itself, but the overwhelming uncertainty. It shows how forensic interpretation can turn into a tug of war when the marks are ambiguous. If we consider why ambiguity matters so much here, it's because physical evidence is supposed to anchor the narrative. When one set of marks can be explained by 4 or 5 different objects, suddenly the anchor doesn't hold. Forensic science tries to reduce possibilities, but here the possibilities multiply. And that's where behavioral and philosophical interpretation starts to creep in. Let's take the stun gun theory just a little deeper, because it hinges on physiology. A stun gun interferes with neuromuscular control. It basically hijacks the body's electrical system and makes muscles contract uncontrollably. That's why someone tased usually screams, spasms, and shows burn-like marks. If the abrasions on JonBenet don't look like burns but more like shallow scrapes, then physiologically the stun gun explanation doesn't fit. That's technical language, but put simply, the skin reacts differently to electricity than it does to pressure. Now, let's look again at why the train track idea gained traction, because it's really about matching patterns. Forensic analysts often line up wounds against potential objects like puzzle pieces. If the spacing between 2 prongs of a toy train track matches the spacing of 2 abrasions, that starts to look convincing. But matching alone doesn't equal proof. It's more like this is possible rather than this is definite. In other words, it's like seeing shoe prints that could fit a shoe size, but without the shoe in hand, you can't be sure. And if we move into the philosophy of offender decision-making, we can see why people reject the stun gun. An intruder who supposedly knew the family's routines, house layout, and habits is described as careful and deliberate. Why would such a careful intruder bring a noisy tool like a stun gun that could cause screams and chaos? Logically, it doesn't make sense. Criminology often looks for coherence between method and motive, and here the stun gun disrupts that coherence. On the other side of this, improvisation makes sense too, because if someone inside the house acted in the moment, they would reach for what was nearby rather than planning in advance. That's why the train track theory fits a different psychological frame: impulse over preparation. From a layman's perspective, it's the difference between showing up with a toolbox versus just grabbing what's within arm's reach. Now, the really fascinating part is how the purpose behind the marks overshadows the object itself. Were the marks meant to test if JonBenet was responsive? Were they the result of panic? Or were they simply incidental? Each interpretation tells a very different story about the mindset of the actor. Forensics can show us what happened physically, but psychology digs into the why. If we look at the issue of screams, it adds another angle. Neighbors reportedly heard noises that night. If the abrasions caused pain, that could have led to a cry. It's interesting because we often assume the scream was tied to other actions, but maybe the prod itself was enough. This pushes us to consider that such a small detail could connect to the bigger auditory puzzle in the case. And this brings us to timing, which is one of the most contested aspects. Forensic experts debate whether the abrasions happened before or after certain critical moments. If they occurred earlier, they may have triggered a reaction. If they occurred later, they might have been the result of desperation when responsiveness was already gone. Layman's way to put it, the same mark means something entirely different depending on when it happened. Another critical point is the ransom letter's mismatch with the physical evidence. The letter frames everything as though this were about John Ramsey, his job, his money, his supposed enemies, but the physical marks are centered entirely on JonBenet, not John. That contradiction is telling. Philosophically, this looks like misdirection, trying to convince investigators to look outward at John when the evidence points inward toward the child. And if we go deeper into the word accident, this becomes very tricky. People often throw that word around, but in criminology and law, it has very specific meanings. Accidental can mean unintended harm from a deliberate act, or it can mean completely unforeseen mishap. In layman's terms, swinging a golf club is deliberate, but accidentally clipping someone nearby isn't. The difference is huge, and it colors how people view Burke's past actions and denials. Burke's quick denial itself is also a big piece, because some saw it as natural, while others saw it as suspicious. Quick denials can be read as honesty. You don't even have to think about it, but they can also be read as rehearsed. This is one of those areas where psychology doesn't give a clean answer. It's less about the words and more about how audiences interpret the speed of those words. And the contradictions between different witnesses add fuel to the fire. John and Patsy frame past incidents as innocent accidents. Judith Phillips frames the same incidents as deliberate. The science doesn't resolve this because abrasions and bruises can't tell us about intent. They only show that an impact happened, so we're left with interpretation, and interpretation is colored by relationships, biases, and memory. Another thing that stands out is forensic parsimony, the principle that the simplest explanation is often best. If the marks can be explained by a toy train track found in the house, that's simpler than believing an intruder brought in a stun gun with surgical precision. Simplicity isn't proof, but it carries weight in deductive reasoning. In plain English, it's like asking why cook up an elaborate story when a straightforward one works. What's also fascinating is the intersection between physiology and psychology here. The skin tells us about pressure, force, and timing. The psychology tells us about panic, control, or testing. Put together, the abrasions are both a physical clue and a window into mindset. One doesn't explain the other alone, but combined, they give us a fuller picture. And maybe the most crucial takeaway is that these marks, small as they are, have become a focal point because they bridge so many aspects of the case. They link to forensics, to psychology, to philosophy, and to criminology. They embody the uncertainty of the investigation. In the end, the marks aren't just about what object made them, they're about the unanswered question of why they were made, and that's what keeps this debate alive. Coming out of this long discussion, what stands out most is how such a small detail, two tiny abrasions, has managed to spark so many competing theories. On one side, you have Lou Smith and his conviction that a stun gun explained everything. On another, James Kolar in the CBS special pushing the train track idea, and in the middle, Burke Ramsey with his firm denial that anything like that ever happened. The very fact that something so minor can split experts, family members, and public opinion shows just how slippery this case is when it comes to certainty. It's worth remembering that forensics can tell us what happened to the skin, but it can't tell us why someone did it. That's where psychology steps in. Was this mark about panic, control, or testing? Was it part of something deliberate, or was it incidental? Layman's way to think about it is this. The body leaves behind a record, but interpreting that record is like reading a diary written in shorthand, where every reader comes away with a different story. What also keeps this alive is how narrative framing shapes public interpretation. When CBS presents a train track theory, millions of viewers start to believe it. When Smith insists on a stun gun, his credibility as a seasoned detective makes it persuasive. And when Burke says no, it draws people to question tone, timing, and body language as much as the words themselves. The marks in this sense aren't just evidence, they're also props in a much larger story. And if we take one last step into criminological thinking, the abrasions become symbolic of the whole case. They represent ambiguity, contradiction, and the tension between science and speculation. They remind us that crime scenes don't always tell clean stories, and that evidence is rarely free from interpretation. Philosophically, they're almost like a riddle, forcing us to look again and again, only to find new questions instead of final answers. So as we wind down, the big takeaway is that the abrasions cannot be neatly explained by one object or one motive. They sit at the crossroads of forensic detail and human interpretation, pointing us back to the complexity of the case itself. And maybe that's why this detail keeps coming up, because it refuses to settle, and in that refusal, it keeps the mystery alive. And, as always, I appreciate your love and support. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments. And until next time, take it easy.